The galaxy dies in silence first, a whisper through the void, a dimming of the Astronomicon's guiding flame, and then a shiver in the warp as if some ancient predator stirs. Worlds that once sang with the clamor of industry and the fervent chants of the imperial creed fall still. Their voices devoured not by time nor rebellion, but by a hunger older than memory. Where the Tyranid high fleets pass, no echo remains. Only a husk of matter stripped bare, a planet bled to bone, and the faint psychic aftertaste of terror lingering in the void. To speak of a world consumed by Tyranids is to describe not just destruction, but erasure. Not conquest, but silence. And silence is the one thing humanity cannot bear. Before we descend into that silence, remember this. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, and its survival depends on vigilance. If you find yourself immersed in these chronicles of ruin, lend your strength by joining us. Like, share, and subscribe so that the voice of humanity might echo a little longer in the night. For only together can we endure what waits in the dark. The people of Callus Prime did not know the hour of their ending when it began. In the great hive towers, the air recyclers still pumped their choking mists through rusted ducts, and the manufactorum engines still screamed with labor as if nothing had changed. The laborers bent their backs to the will of their overseers, chanting prayers to the Omnicia between shifts, unaware that their world was already marked. It was the smallest of things at first, a thinning of the harvest in the agri-districts, a subtle warp to the songs of the Mechanicus choirs who tuned the Auspex towers. The priests said it was ill omen, but the lords of the hive dismissed it as weather, as supply error, as the usual decay that gnawed at every imperial world. But men who stared too long at the stars knew better. They spoke of a shadow where no star should be, a smudge of ink spreading across the void. The readings on their data slates stuttered and blurred, as if unseen claws scraped the edges of the machine spirits themselves. The senior Magi, robed in the sigils of Mars, frowned at the numbers and whispered their unease through vox grills clogged with static. They petitioned the planetary governor for vigilance, but he was a man made fat by decades of slow decadence, who trusted more in the imperial tithe than in omens. He ordered silence, for silence was easier than fear. Yet silence is fragile. It cracks with the first scream. The crops in the agrizones withered to husks, not from drought or blight, but as if something deep within the soil had been drained. Whole fields stood gray and brittle, their stalks crumbling at the touch. The serfs muttered of curses, of ghosts beneath the furrows. They lit incense before crude imperial aquili hammered into the earth, but the incense could not fill the gnawing hollowness that seemed to rise from beneath their boots. Then came the stillness of the skies. The birds were the first to vanish. Then the vermin. Then the carrion beasts that fed on both. The land itself was emptying. Those who manned the orbital Auspex towers did not sleep. Their eyes red, their lips cracked from whispered litanies. They watched the growing blur in the void and knew it for what it was. The astropaths cried blood in their cells, their minds pierced by psychic murmurs that had no voice. One spoke before his eyes burst. "The stars are drowning." His corpse was locked away in silence, for none wished to hear what followed. By the time the administratum clerks noticed the missing shipments, by the time the tithe officers prepared their complaints, by the time the first scribes stamped reports of agricultural deficiency, the shadow had already reached the system's edge. It was vast, vaster than words could encompass. No fleet of orcs, no wandering migration of Eldar, no renegade pirate armada had ever been so immense. It blotted the light of suns, and the void itself seemed to pulse with its presence. It was the shadow in the warp, the herald of the great devourer.
And still, upon the hive towers of Callus Prime, life continued in its ritual misery. The miners broke stone. The manufactura forged their weapons. The ecclesiastiarchy led hymns that grew more strained with each passing week, as if the priests themselves feared that their voices carried only into the dark. No word had yet come from Terra, no order yet from Segmentum Command. The people of Callus Prime believed themselves alone, abandoned beneath an empty sky. They were not abandoned. They were prey. It began with the storms. Ash-black clouds gathered without warning, seething across the horizon like smoke from 1,000 unseen pyres. Lightning crackled in strange colors, sickly green and violet, searing scars into the heavens. The rain that fell was not water, but stinging filth that corroded metal and blistered flesh. The Magos biologists who tested the rainfall found nothing natural in its composition. It reeked of spores, of seedings cast down in advance of an invasion. But when they sent their reports upward, silence answered them. Some say the governor's scribes burned the data slates. Others whisper the Magi themselves vanished into the depths of their temples, never to be seen again. And still the shadow grew. At night, the skies shone with false auroras, spectral veils of crimson and pale blue that shifted like the beating of some unseen heart. Children woke screaming, saying they had dreamt of teeth, of endless teeth grinding in the void. Mothers silenced them with hymns, but the hymns themselves faltered. Even the most fervent preachers found their words empty. The faith of the people was not extinguished, but it was shaken, like a candle guttering before a storm. It was then that the first ships broke from the void. Not sleek vessels of the Imperial Navy, nor the proud hulls of Astarte's battle barges, but things shaped like living wounds. They moved with the slow grace of predators, their carapaces glistening with the light of distant stars, their forms half organism, half weapon. Where they passed, vox signals died. Where they lingered, the very auspex arrays screamed with interference as if choked by unseen hands. The shadow had taken form. The people of Callus Prime had no name for it then, but in every whispered tongue it meant the same: the end. The first shadows had fallen, and the world was already theirs. The arrival of the first bioships was not a battle, but a silence. The orbital stations that had stood sentinel for centuries, their walls layered with promethium cannons and lance batteries, did not fire a single shot. Their crew vanished in stillness, their vox links breaking one by one, until the great stations hung in orbit like tombs, their warning lights blinking into the void unanswered. No wreckage scattered, no distress calls carried. It was as though the men and women within had been plucked out of existence, leaving only hollow steel shells. And below, on the surface, the people looked up to see their guardians floating like dead eyes above their sky. The Planetary Defense Force tried to hold their courage. Old tanks rumbled from their barracks, their tracks grinding sparks against rust-choked streets. Gun servitors were marched out and oiled, their vox grills croaking litanies they did not understand. The officers assured the masses that this was only another Xenos raid, that the Emperor had never abandoned his worlds. They ordered parades through the hive towers, their banners snapping defiantly in the poisoned winds. But even the children, staring from behind their mothers' shawls, knew those banners were frayed. They knew the soldiers marched not for war, but for hope, and hope itself was dying.
The first rains of sporefall began as a whisper of ash, mistaken by many for the dust storms that often swept across the equatorial wastes. But the ash did not settle. It clung, sticky and alive, pulsing faintly when pressed between trembling fingers. Soon it thickened, falling in globs of mucus-like substance that hissed upon contact with stone. Men wiped their brows and found the smear clinging, burning. Livestock collapsed, foaming at the mouth, their hides splitting with pale protrusions that writhed like unborn things. The farmers begged for aid, but their pleas were lost in the roar of vox silence, for no transmission carried beyond the shadow. In the great cathedra of the ecclesiarchy, Cardinal Verus declared the phenomenon a trial of faith. He lifted his arms before the crowd, his robes stiff with incense, and shouted that the emperor tested them, that no Xenos could undo his design. But as he cried out, the spore rain fell through the shattered stained glass above him, and the congregation watched in horror as the cardinal's face blistered and sagged under the living filth. They dragged him away screaming, but the echo of his faith drowned in the wet hiss of falling corruption. The Magos biologists who survived the first rains sent their acolytes into the wastes, clad in sealed robes of bronze and brass. Those who returned carried samples in glass cylinders, writhing with larval creatures that twisted against the containment fields. The Magos spoke in clipped tones, their voices shaking with fear they dared not name. This is not plague. This is not storm. This is invasion. And though they sent this truth to the governor's palace, the message was never read aloud. The scribes locked it away in vaults of secrecy, terrified not of the swarm, but of the chaos that truth would bring. Still, the common folk knew. They knew in the way the skies never cleared, in the way their dreams grew louder, filled with gnashing hunger. They knew in the way the birds and vermin had not returned, as if the very world were being emptied in preparation for something greater. Mothers whispered to their sons not to look at the sky, for they said the longer one stared, the closer the shadow crept. And when men gazed too long into the false auroras, some fell dead where they stood, their eyes rolled white, their last breath gurgling as though drowned in invisible seas. The Astra Militarum regiments stationed upon Callus Prime finally received their summons. Columns of armored chimeras and Lehman Russ tanks thundered through the hive gates, their hulls scorched with old campaign scars, their crews grim-eyed veterans of wars fought on forgotten frontiers. Their commander, Lord Castellan Routh, swore before his men that they would hold this world as they had held 100 others. His voice was iron, but his hands trembled where no one could see. He had fought orcs, he had fought heretics, he had even glimpsed the shimmering cruelty of Eldar raiders, but never had he faced the unknown, the endless, the hunger that blotted stars. And so the drills began, trenches carved through the wastes, heavy bolter nests fortified in hive approaches. Vox grills blared endless hymns of defiance, drowning the silence with words that rang hollow even to those who spoke them. Civilians were conscripted by the thousands, their hands blistered around lasguns they had never fired, their hearts filled with dread they could not voice. Yet for all their preparation, there was no enemy to fight. Only the rain, only the silence, only the shadow pressing heavier with every heartbeat. Until the sky broke open. One night, when the false auroras burned brightest, the heavens split with fire. Comet-like forms streaked downward, tearing trails of flame across the stars. At first, the defenders cheered, thinking them salvation, reinforcements from the fleet. But when the shapes grew closer, their cheers curdled. These were no ships. They were living meteors, spore pods screaming as they punched through the atmosphere, their carapaces shattering upon impact, their insides spilling into the streets with the wet crunch of birthing flesh. From them crawled things that had no names, creatures of claw and chitin, eyeless yet seeing, mindless yet guided. The first Tyranids had come to ground, and the war for Callus Prime had begun. The first spore pods cracked open in the underhives, where the light of the false auroras could not reach. In those lightless warrens, the poor had always lived unseen, their cries muffled by the thunder of the manufactura above. Now their screams carried, echoing up through rusted vents and broken grills, carried on the wings of terror. Those who rushed down to aid them found only gore-slicked passages, the walls trembling with the scuttling of things that moved too fast to be seen, only glimpsed in the flash of muzzle fire before the shooters were dragged away. The creatures that emerged first were small, almost laughably so to the hardened veterans of the guard. Gaunts, with their thin, angled limbs and jutting bone rifles, no taller than a man, no stronger than a trained beast. But there were thousands. They poured from every ruptured spore like water from a breached dam, their claws tearing into anything that moved, their shrieks filling the air like the shrill piping of broken flutes. Las fire burned them down in dozens, heavy bolters tore them apart in gory sprays, but still they came, skittering across the corpses of their kin as if the dead were no more than stepping stones. Lord Castellan Roth gave the order to seal the underhives. Whole districts were cut off, gates slammed, blast doors welded shut with men, women, and children still trapped inside. Their fists pounded against iron, their voices rose in panicked hymns. But above the gates the guard stood silent, knowing what lay behind could not be saved. The screams did not stop. They only grew wetter, softer, until silence fell once more. The manufactura were the next to fall. Spore pods cratered through adamantine roofs, splitting the forges and spilling fire across assembly lines. Servitors fought with mechanical indifference, their chain blades whirring as they were torn limb from limb. Skitarii phalanxes marched into the infernos, their galvanic rifles crackling, their chants to the Omnissiah lost in the shrieking static that blanketed every vox. They held for a time, their iron discipline unyielding even as their numbers thinned. But the Tyranids adapted. New forms slithered from the spore pits, larger, heavier, their carapace thick enough to turn lasfire into sparks. Warriors, the vanguard organisms of the swarm, drove into the Skitarii ranks with bone swords that carved ceramite like parchment. The red-robed soldiers of Mars died in silence, their data spirits consumed alongside their flesh. By the third day, the hives themselves shook with the rhythm of the swarm. Streets once clogged with merchants and pilgrims were now rivers of blood. The people fled upward, toward the spires, but the Tyranids were already there. Gargoyles, winged beasts with flesh wings slick as oil, swept down from the skies, plucking refugees from rooftops and dragging them into the black clouds. The Astra Militarum fought block by block, their tanks grinding through avenues piled with corpses, their artillery roaring until the ammunition bins dry. Each victory was measured not in ground won, but in minutes bought. In the governor's palace, silence reigned. The governor himself had not been seen since the first day of the invasion. Rumors spread through the Vox that he had fled on the last orbital shuttle, abandoning his world to the swarm. Others whispered that the Tyranids had taken him alive, dragged him into their capillary towers to be fed upon while still screaming. None knew the truth, but all knew one thing. No orders came, no salvation arrived, and Callus Prime was dying alone. The ecclesiastri did not surrender their voices, even as their flock perished. Priests marched through the streets with torches and aquilae raised high, chanting prayers to the emperor. Some ignited themselves with promethium, their burning bodies held aloft as living icons. The Tyranids tore through them without hesitation, but for a fleeting heartbeat, the fire and the chanting gave the people strength. They died screaming his name, and perhaps that was enough. By the end of the first week, Callus Prime was no longer a world of men. It was a battlefield, its skies clogged with spores, its seas boiling with alien life, its soil cracked by the thrusting of capillary towers that drank deep of its oceans and atmosphere. Still the guard fought on. Still the Skitarii bled. Still the common folk lifted lasguns with shaking hands and fired into the endless tide. But in their hearts they began to understand. There was no victory to be won. Only a question remained. How long could they hold before the swarm consumed them all? And then, from the northern hemisphere, a new sound began to rise. Not the shrieks of gaunts nor the rumble of tanks, but a roar so vast it shook the foundations of the hive towers. The ground trembled, the oceans recoiled, and men fell to their knees clutching their ears. Something far larger than the gaunts, larger even than the warriors, had come to the surface. The Tyranid tide was only beginning. The roar came again, low and resonant, like the grinding of mountains. From the ruptured ground of the northern wastes, titanic shapes emerged, towering over the spires of the hive cities. Carnifexes, the battering rams of the swarm, heaved themselves into the open, their chitinous armor glistening with mucus, their bone crushers raised high. Their every step cracked ferrocrete, their every charge shattered fortifications that had stood for centuries. The defenders who faced them fired until their weapons overheated, but it was like casting sparks against an avalanche. The Lehman Russ battle tanks rolled forward, their cannons spitting fire into the beasts. One Carnifex wheeled as its carapace cracked, ichor spraying in gouts across the battlefield. The soldiers cheered for the first time in days, only to watch as another creature lumbered over the corpse of its kin, unbothered, unrelenting, as if the death of one meant nothing to the swarm as a whole. For it did mean nothing. Each death was calculated, each sacrifice weighed in a gestalt intelligence that saw the battlefield as a board and the defenders as pieces already doomed. Above, the skies writhed with wings. Harpies descended like living bombers, their torsos riddled with sacks that burst in midair, raining down spore mines that rolled along the ground before detonating in acidic clouds. Whole platoons vanished screaming, their flesh boiling away to bone in seconds. The guard responded with Hydra batteries, their autocannons cutting swaths of fire through the skies. But for every winged creature that fell burning into the city streets, 10 more rose from the clouds, blotting the false auroras with their shadows. The Skitarii fought with machine precision, their ranks advancing in lockstep, galvanic rifles crackling arcs of blue that tore through the lesser gaunts by the score. Their cybernetic voices echoed through vox links, chanting praises to the Omnicia, even as their augmetic limbs were hacked away by Tyranid claws. Cohorts locked into rigid formations, plasma calivers glowing, unleashing volleys that could have broken any mortal foe. But the Tyranids did not break. They surged, adapted, shifted their forms with terrifying swiftness. Where the Skitarii cut them down, tougher organisms appeared, bred in the very moment of battle. Where plasma fire burned, thickened chitin grew. Where formations stood, synapse creatures arrived, guiding the swarm with unerring coordination. In the heart of Hive Vedan, the last Vox link to orbit screamed alive. A desperate transmission. The Imperial Navy had arrived. 3 frigates broke through the warp-choked void, their lances burning arcs of light into the black heavens. For a heartbeat, hope returned. Soldiers wept openly as they looked skyward, believing themselves saved. But the hope was ash before it reached their tongues. The bioships moved. Great tentacled forms twisted through the void, launching clouds of living torpedoes that struck the frigates like thunderbolts. Hulls split, decks erupted, void shields flickered and died. In less than an hour, the frigates were carcasses, drifting and consumed, their crews reduced to nutrients even before their screams had ended. Lord Castellan Routh watched from the command bastion of Hive Argin. His hands trembled as he gripped the rail, his eyes reflecting the burning skies. His adjutants begged for orders. He gave them. Hold! Always hold! There was no retreat. No evacuation order had come from Segmentum Command, no salvation from Terra. They would fight until they could not, and then they would die. He knew it. They all knew it. And yet the order stood, as unyielding as the Emperor's gaze.
The civilians suffered most. Whole families crammed into the upper spires, praying the beasts would not climb so high. But the Tyranids climbed everything. Gaunt, scaled, sheer walls with claws that pierced stone. Gargoyles carried men and women screaming into the clouds. And when the barricades fell, when the heavy bolter emplacements ran dry, the swarm poured through in rivers of flesh, flooding hab blocks, manufactora, cathedra alike. There was no sanctuary, not even the shrines. By the second week, the world itself had begun to warp. Capillary towers, vast spines of pulsing flesh thrust upward from the soil, piercing through hives and forges alike. They pulsed with sickly rhythm, drinking oceans, draining rivers, sucking atmosphere into their hollow veins. Where they grew, the land withered, collapsing inward as if the planet's very marrow was being siphoned away. And yet, the towers were only the beginning. Larger shapes coiled around them, guardians bred to defend the harvest. Towering organisms that spat torrents of bioplasm capable of melting armor to slag in seconds. The people of Calis Prime no longer asked when salvation would come, they asked if they would last another dawn. And as the false auroras burned brighter, and the skies filled with wings, and the ground shook with the steps of carnifexes, the answer became clear. They would not. And still the swarm was only sharpening its claws. The last days of Calis Prime's resistance unfolded not as battles, but as unravelings. The proud hives that had once reached for the heavens became tombs, their spires blackened with fire and shrouded in the endless ash of falling spores. What the people had once believed indestructible, their walls, their faith, their very world, proved as fragile as glass under the claws of the swarm. Hive Vedon was the first to die in full. Its outer bastions, manned by thousands of conscripts and garrison troops, fell within hours once the carnifexes breached the curtain walls. The defenders fought with desperate valor, laser guns blazing until their cells overheated and burst in their hands. They bayoneted the gaunts, hurled promethium canisters down stairwells, and detonated charges that collapsed entire districts upon themselves. None of it slowed the tide. The swarm poured over the ruins like water through shattered stone, seeping into every breach, filling every silence with shrieks and chittering claws. By dawn, Hive Vedon was silent, its spires crawling with winged creatures, feasting upon the corpses that carpeted its streets. Hive Argin lasted longer. Lord Castellan Routh held his command bastion until the very end, his vox grill blaring hymns of defiance as the swarm battered against the walls. His tanks formed iron phalanxes in the avenues, their cannons roaring until the barrels glowed red and split. Infantry squads fought from windows and rooftops, cutting down the swarm in curtains of las fire that turned the streets into rivers of steaming ichor. The Castellan himself strode into battle clad in carapace armor, his power sword a line of blue light as he carved through the endless horde. But there was no end. When the bastion finally fell, Routh's body was never found. Some claimed they saw him dragged beneath the tide of claws, still striking until the last breath left him. Others whispered that the Tyranids consumed him in full, leaving no trace but the echo of his final order. Hold. The Mechanicus enclaves fell in eerie silence. The Skitarii legions, their augmetics gleaming in the red haze of battle, locked ranks in the ruins of their forges.
They fired in perfect synchrony, volleys precise and unbroken, even as their numbers dwindled. For hours they held, machine voices reciting binary litanies without falter. Then the swarm shifted. Zoanthropes descended, their swollen craniums glowing with psychic fire, unleashing storms of energy that shattered Skitarii phalanxes like glass. Even the readouts of the tech priests crumbled under the assault, their shrines to the Omnisia buried beneath rivers of chitin and bone. When the swarm moved on, nothing remained but smoldering forges and the flicker of machine spirits extinguished.
The people fled into the wastes. Thousands abandoned the hives, streaming into deserts and mountains, believing they might outpace the swarm. But the swarm had no boundaries. It followed. It hunted. The gaunts tracked them, the gargoyles swooped upon them, and from beneath the sands great mallochs burst, swallowing entire caravans in a single strike. The survivors scattered like dust before a storm. There was nowhere left to run. As the capillary towers grew, the planet itself began to change. The oceans receded into vast sinkholes, leaving behind cracked basins, strewn with the carcasses of sea life, twisted and consumed. Forests shriveled into dust, their nutrients drawn upward into fleshy conduits that pulsed like beating hearts. The skies, once alive with the smoke of industry, became a single curtain of living cloud, thick with spores that blotted out the stars. The world that had been Callus Prime was already gone, its bones hollowed to feed the hunger of another. In the final hours, a message escaped. Somehow, through the shadow in the warp, a single astropath carved his cry into the void. His eyes had already bled to ruin, his skin drawn taut as his mind burned in contact with the psychic roar of the swarm. Still he forced the words out before he collapsed, lifeless upon the stone of his cell. "We are lost. The shadow has come. The great devourer is here." His soul flickered into the immaterium like a dying ember, but his words carried, a warning to any who would hear. And then there was silence. The hives stood black and broken, the oceans lay drained, the skies crawled with wings. Nothing human stirred. Callus Prime had fallen, consumed not only in flesh, but in memory. What had once been a world of industry, of faith, of toil and song was now a husk, wrapped in the coils of alien towers. The swarm fed, and in its feeding, all that had been was erased. But the galaxy is vast, and Callus Prime was only one voice in the endless chorus of human worlds. As its silence spread outward, others listened. The next planet in the path of the swarm trembled. The next governor sat sleepless upon his throne. And across the stars, the Imperium whispered the question that none dared answer. If one world could vanish so quickly, what hope had any world at all? The warning from Callus Prime arrived on Duran Secundus like a blade pressed against the throat of a sleeping world. The astropathic cry bled through the shadow and the warp, ragged and faint, but it carried enough to strip the color from every face that heard it. Vox officers stared at one another over flickering consoles. Adepts of the Administratum dropped their data slates. A junior preacher in the Spire's chapel forgot the final line of the litany and stood with his mouth open, as if the words themselves had been devoured. Within the hour, the sirens began. Within the day, the gates of the hive fortresses ground shut on columns of refugees who would never see their homes again. Within the week, the sky had changed. You could taste it in the rain first. A metallic tang that made the tongue ache and the throat tighten, as if you'd swallowed filings from a rusted cog. Forged chimneys burned hotter to cleanse the air, but the smoke only smeared the horizon into a bruise-colored band. And behind that bruise, the auroras gathered, thin veils at first, then heavy pulsing curtains that rose and fell like the breath of something sleeping above the atmosphere.
The tech priests of the principal manufactorum, their faces latticed with sanctified augmetics, bled incense into the intake ducts and traced wards across the machine spirits with stylus and oil. The machine spirits did not answer. Auspec's reading stepped down the scale as if counting, not hours, heartbeats. On the trench lines outside Hive Albrax, mud swallowed men to the knees and wouldn't let go. The first rank of Lemon Russ battle tanks settled their weight into emplacements cut with the precision of a ritual. Each tank bore kill tally scrolls stiff with wax seals, and each crew muttered its own quiet prayer to the Emperor as power couplings clattered and main guns slewed to interlock fields of fire. Between the armor packs, earthworks bristled with heavy bolters, whose gunners kept their hands tucked into their armpits for warmth and superstition. Behind them, field medicate tents breathed steam and antiseptic, and behind those, deeper in the hive, altar bells pealed for the third time that day.
We had orders to hold the apron roads and the waste basins beyond them, to keep the sky clear long enough for the Navy to punch a corridor through the upper atmosphere and set fire to whatever descended. The order was clear on the data slate, its runes etched with the seal of the planetary commandant, and a smaller sigil, less common, that meant the Adeptus Mechanicus had rewritten part of the plan. The Skitarii would anchor the flanks with galvanic coils and kill zones measured in exacting distances. The Guard would absorb the rush. The Navy would arrive when it could. The Astartes, a rumor whispered by corporals to steady conscripts, might be coming, though no seal or sigil swore to it. Rumor can be a uniform when hope runs thin. When the Auspex screens finally steadied on a shape, there was a moment, one moment where everyone looked up as if a single mind had told us to. The sky was a dull coin. Then the coin turned. Streaks like quill marks raked across the cloud shelf, thousands at first, then tens of thousands, each line a falling spore. Their contrails braided and unbraided, smearing into luminous wounds that refused to close. Searchlights caught the first pods as they burned in, congealed meteors that sheared into petals at terminal height. They opened like mouths, and the mouths were full of claws. The first impact tore a crater into the basin and hurled wet heat across the trench lines. Gaunts spilled in ropes and thickets, holding their bone rifles low like beasts that had learned the lesson of our cover the instant before they were born. Lasfire lit the mud into flickering shoals and dented the night with afterimages, but the swarm didn't take cover, didn't pause, didn't weigh options. It moved as a thought. Where we cut it, it flowed around the blade. Where we burned it, it learned our flame. On the left, the Skitarii opened in chorus. Their galvanic rifles cracked the air into blue tessellations, each shot placed where Amagos had mapped it to land an hour before we saw the enemy. Cohorts stepped into new angles with a unity that belonged to metronomes and sermons. A tech priest Dominus strode the lip of a revetment. Mechadendrites unfurled like a saint's halo forged from instrument arms, intoning praises to the Omnissiah through a vox grill that warbled under interference. Around him, the air smelled like solder and burned chitin. For a minute that felt like more than a minute, the left held as if the world had hinges. Then the left learned a new word: warrior. They came heavier, chitin-ridged and lacquered with impacts our eyes could tally, but our fire could not finish. Bone swords rose and fell with a laborer's rhythm, unornamented, merciless, and the Skitarii line juddered. A cohort commander took a blade through the torso and didn't fall until the second stroke severed the spine of his exoskeleton. The first had only killed the man inside. We heard the binary rise in pitch and felt it in our teeth. The Dominus answered with the cold flare of a plasma weapon and turned a warrior into two screaming halves that still tried to crawl. The halves didn't frighten anyone, the shadows behind them did. We had practiced for fear. There were drills for it, catechisms to slow the pulse and return the fingers to the trigger. But drills didn't teach the sound of a harpy's descent, the way the air folds under a living bomber,
the way your lungs forget their orders when spore mines fall like a choir of bells you can't see. The hydras woke with the old faithful derision of autocannon recoil, shells stitching ladders through the cloud bottom, winged shapes tumbled and burned, and the spore mines popped in strings along the ridge, each explosion a brief dome of acid that revealed, for a blink, the outlines of the things coming after them. In the first hour we held because we were supposed to. In the second hour we held because to fall back meant abandoning the Medicaid tents where the surgeons worked with saws and sealant foam and prayers. By the third hour, the trenches ran with a thickness that dulled boots and memory both. Las packs hissed empty too soon. Loaders moved with the calm of men who know they will not sleep again. Runners skidded between dugouts with orders salted with grit and blood, and at some point the Voxnet learned a new voice, a woman in the manufactorum quarter, sergeant by her cadence, calling targets the Auspex couldn't see as if she stood on a roof above the whole siege and placed our shots by hand. We never found her later. That didn't make her less real. Night bent, but it didn't break. The auroras thickened into slow veins, and the sky adopted their pulse. Our eyes learned to read that rhythm, and in its throb we saw the outline of a shape that had not yet shown its face, a mass that the gaunts served, and the warriors guarded, and the harpies fed with the bodies of everything that flew against it. When the ground began to tremble, as if something were tapping from below to be let in, a junior officer beside me whispered that it had to be artillery walking its fire closer. We did not have artillery in that quadrant anymore. He said it again, as if repetition could forge it true.
The tremor swelled into a tread. Ferrocrete seams in the apron road exhaled dust. A Lehman Russ to our right adjusted 2 degrees, then 3, then set its barrel at a height that meant its gunner had seen something he couldn't bear to name over the intercom. The searchlight tracked with him. What it found at the edge of its beam did not fit inside the light. The Carnifex stepped into the circle, and the circle got smaller by comparison. Plates of chitin lapped like kilned armor, each ridge scored by old battles that had taught it everything it had to know about ours. It braced, inhaled with a sound that made the trench timbers creak, and charged. The tank's first round hammered into the thing's torso and shifted at a handspan. The second sheared a mask of plates from the jaw, and the jaw grinned without humor. The third shot never left the barrel. The Carnifex arrived and turned steel into noise. We had learned to aim at eyes and joints. We had learned the teaspoon's lesson against an ocean. Still, we poured it on, las fire and plasma, grenades that burst against that hide like rain. The Dominus on the left drove a spear of actinic light through the Carnifex's shoulder, and the beast answered by ripping the forward parapet out of the earth and hurling it back into us. The parapet had our own minds wired under it. The minds remembered whose soil they were in. When the dust sloughed away, the Carnifex bled and did not consider dying. Behind it, more bodies crowded the dark, a wave of moving walls, and among their feet the smaller shapes skittered, baying through lipless vents that had never spoken a word, but spoke hunger perfectly. The Vox filled with reports we could not answer, and names that would not be read. The woman from the manufactorum fell silent in mid-syllable. The third hour ended. The fourth did not wait to be named. The fourth hour was not measured in minutes, but in sections lost. The forward trench was gone. The left flank existed only as a smear of blood and bent steel, and in its place the swarm built its own bulwark of corpses, as if daring us to see how quickly the tide could refill the space we thought we owned. In the command dugout, data slates crackled with incoming reports that contradicted each other, not because they were false, but because the battlefield itself was breaking the language we used to describe it. Units dissolved, voices cut off mid-code, coordinates warped into nonsense as if the Auspex arrays themselves recoiled from what they saw. Lord Castellan Helbrecht, who had taken command of the siege after Routh's death on Callus Prime, stood with his hands pressed against a mapboard that no longer matched the earth beneath our boots. He did not curse, did not beg. He looked once at the men before him, then ordered the inner curtain walls armed and the outer lines abandoned. It was not retreat, it was concession. And the men obeyed because what else was left to do? The withdrawal was chaos. The trenches that had been dug with such care became graves when we tried to climb out, the mud sucking at boots, the dead clutching the ankles of the living. Gaunts swarmed after us, screeching through their lipless maws, bone rifles firing in bursts that melted into the air like glass shattering. Medicae teams tried to carry the wounded, but the wounded begged to be left behind, their eyes wild with the knowledge that they slowed the living. Some were obeyed, others were not. In both cases, the swarm caught up. The sky never cleared. Harpies and gargoyles wheeled above, swooping down to claw men from the causeways, their shadows tangled against the burning auroras. Hydra batteries kept firing, their crews half-mad from exhaustion, their ears bleeding from the concussive roar. They cut swathes through the winged predators, but for each creature that fell screaming into the muck, another rose, fresh-born, from spore sacs that burst in midair. Even the sky was breeding. Within Hive Albrax, the inner defenses lit the night. Heavy bolters rattled until their barrels fused, missile racks coughed smoke into already choked air, and the walls became an unbroken ribbon of muzzle flashes. The manufactorum quarter was converted into a gun deck, every window lined with lasguns, every rooftop braced with sandbags and autocannons. Civilians stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, their hands shaking on triggers they had never pulled before. The ecclesiastragy marched among them, holding aloft aquilae that gleamed in the firelight, chanting prayers that grew ragged as the hours lengthened. Faith gave them strength, but even faith has a breaking point.
The swarm did not come as one mass now. It came in waves, each tailored to the defense it faced. When bolters cut down gaunts, thicker forms followed. When armor held, bioplasma spat from the mouths of living artillery that crouched in the wastes and vomited fire until steel sagged like wax. When barricades stood, trigons tunneled beneath, rising in showers of dirt and stone, their maws opening wide enough to swallow squads whole. The hive shook with every impact, every new breach. We patched what we could, braced what we couldn't, and told ourselves the Navy must be close, must be preparing a strike to burn this tide from the stars. But the Navy was silent. The Vox crackled with interference, sometimes breaking into fragments of human voices that may have been distress calls or may have been nothing more than the echoes of the swarm itself pressing against the warp. Rumor filled the silence. Some said the fleet had been ambushed before reaching orbit. Others whispered of astropaths gone mad, tearing their eyes from their skulls as they screamed of a hunger too vast to comprehend. None of us knew the truth, and truth mattered little when the walls themselves shook under the hammer of claws. By the end of the 4th hour, the defenders no longer fired for victory. They fired for time. Time for the wounded to be dragged deeper into the hive. Time for the last refugees to cram into the vaults below the manufactorum. Time for prayers to reach the emperor, though even the priests admitted their words felt swallowed before they left their lips. Every round, every lasbolt, every swing of a bayonet was an offering of seconds. Seconds were all we had left. And still, beneath the thunder of guns and the shriek of the dying, another sound rose, a deeper resonance, like the groan of the world itself under unbearable weight. The capillary towers had begun to root, their pulsing spines punching through the hive's foundations, spreading veins into the soil below. The planet itself was being rewritten, and we stood firing on its surface like men holding back a tide with bare hands. The inner curtain wall did not fail all at once. It shuddered in sections, like an old bell tower trying to remember the note it was forged to sing, and then, there, where the apron road kinked between two manufactura,
Stone and adamantine peeled back as neatly as the lid of a ration tin. A trigon erupted through the breach in a geyser of brick dust and shattered light, its plated length flexing in a single contemptuous arc that tore a heavy bolter nest from its moorings. The gun team vanished under the creature's shadow, and when the dust cleared, there was only the gun, still clamped by hands that were no longer attached to anything that could pull a trigger. We fell back 1 block, then 2. Fighting from doorways and machine bays, every corridor a barrel that funneled the swarm into killing angles that should have favored us. They did not. The gaunts came faster inside the hive, claws clattering on tiled floors, bone rifles punching through plaster and flesh as if there was no difference worth naming. In the red breath of the Manufactorum quarter, Skitarii cohorts pivoted with drill book grace, their galvanic fire stitching meshes across the mouths of side streets, while mechanodendrite snaked from the shadows to weld shut doors behind us. An Onager dune crawler stalked the central concourse like a pilgrim crab, its neutron laser drawing a white line through an exocrine that was trying to heave its bulk over a heap of wreckage. The beam carved the thing open from crest to belly, and a wash of boiling ichor drowned the lower steps. For a heartbeat, the street was ours again. Then, Synapse arrived. It came as stillness, not silence, never silence, but a sudden unanimity of the swarm's frenzy into intention. Gaunts that had hurled themselves against our fire with animal impatience now checked and spread, their claws tapping out the rhythm of a single mind. Warriors stepped into lanes with the authority of overseers, and behind them a figure unfolded like a blade pulled from a sheath too small to hold it. The hive tyrant's silhouette made my eyes water, too tall for the street, too wide for the light, crowned in horned plates that threw back muzzle flashes and fractured halos. When it moved, the gaunts surged. When it pointed, the living artillery outside answered. When its void-black gaze dipped across the concourse, men forgot to breathe.
The Dominus on our left lifted a staff crackling with captive suns and spat a lance of plasma that should have cored a tank at a mile. The tyrant's bone sword sheared the beam as if it were cloth. The backwash scorched the dune crawler's carapace and sent it staggering, leg pistons screeching. I saw the Dominus sway, picked slate sigils fluttering in his eyes, and heard the binary in my vox drop a half tone. Shock, then recalculation, as tech priests dragged him down behind a scaffold draped with prayer scrolls gone black at the edges from heat. We called for reserves we didn't have, and were answered by names we'd already written on the casualty slate. The Medicae station 2 streets back overflowed into the gutters, stretchers lined like teeth, the air sharp with sealant foam and the copper tang of blood. A priest moved between the cots with an aquila held so high his shoulders trembled, whispering blessings into ears that no longer heard. He paused when a shadow crossed his face and turned in time to meet a lictor. No one saved him, and no one could. The thing folded him into itself the way a cloak folds around a throat on a winter night, and was gone again across the rafters, ghost pale and wet with other people. We boxed the tyrant in with rubble and fire. It did not mind our geometry. It raised a fist and a storm answered, bioplasma flung from some crouching behemoth beyond the wall, splattering the concourse into steaming pits. The dune crawler toppled with a cough of sacred smoke, and a squeal like a violin dragged across broken glass. Skitarii stepped into its place without looking at the wreck, their optic lenses reflecting blue bolts, and fell in the same pace they had held when we still believed the wall could not break. Discipline is a kind of mercy. It lets a man die in the shape of his oath. Behind us in deeper manufactura, where the air tasted of oil and iron filings, we set a line among the machines. Conveyor decks became breastworks, servo arms reared like giant incept limbs over our helmets, and between them we built a forest of tripwires in charges with fuses we tore from lamps because the proper cordage had run to stubs. Civilians stood between benches, faces gray with grit, eyes fever bright. One woman, hair tied with a strip of cog-patterned cloth, hands scarred from a life of work, lifted a lasgun in a grip that said she had never held one before and would never put it down while a single round remained. She asked me, without raising her voice,
where she should stand to do the most good. I pointed to a gap in the line where the glow of our coils didn't quite meet. She nodded once, as if I had given her the answer to a question she had been asking for years. The first push into the machine force broke against our charges and fell back drag-marked. The second reached the benches. The third learned the names of our dead and fed us their echoes in the instant before it closed. We switched to bayonets when Lazpaks hissed dry and discovered that a gaunt's weight is less than you think until it's on your chest and the breath is driven out of you by the clever angle of its claw. I remember the taste of coolant on the air, and the way the floor shook when a Carnifex shouldered through a doorway never designed for anything but men and tools. Helbrecht's voice cut the Vox wide. Not a speech, not a promise, coordinates, intervals, the clean lexicon of a man drawing a final line and asking the world to respect it. He committed the last reserve, a wedge of armor and bodies aimed like a nail at the tyrant's advance. For a block we drove it, not back but sideways, off the line that led to the vault doors where the last of the unarmed had clustered. The hive tyrant learned our trick and turned its answer. A gesture, a shiver, and the ceiling unstitched as something burrowed through the superstructure above and dropped, an avalanche of rubble and chitin that slammed the wedge into a single tangled mass of halted momentum. When the dust settled, the nail was bent. We fell to alleys, to catwalks hung over vats that steamed like open mouths, to stairwells that ended in welded plates because someone with a torch believed that denial could be manufactured. A brood of gene stealers took the third stair from the bottom in a single mirrored glide, and I understood in that falling second of recognition why stories survive longer than worlds. Men had told each other about hands like that since caves were new. We threw promethium down the well and the shaft breathed fire back at us, a single exhalation that seared eyebrows and memory both. And for 10 heartbeats, the stairwell was a sun we had built from fear and fuel. The light died. The auroras outside pulsed as if in sympathy, as if some vast lung had taken our flame into itself and found it wanting. Somewhere deeper in the hive, a siren began to wind, a pitch that rose and rose until it stopped pretending to be a warning and became a statement. The vault seals were cycling. Someone had decided that the living below would outlast the dying above, and had chosen which doors to trust. The Vox carried the click of a key turned in a lock we'd never see. Between the machine bays, the tyrant stepped into view again. Its plate slick and smoking, its bone sword black with ash. It looked at us, as if measuring the distance between a question and an answer, lifted its weapon, and pointed, not at the strongest point in our line, but at the woman with the cog cloth in her hair.
The hive tyrant's blade did not fall. It did not need to. The gaunts obeyed before the gesture was finished, a tide that poured toward the woman as if her defiance had been marked, catalogued, and answered. She fired with a steadiness born not of training, but of necessity, her lasbolts stitching red across the first rank. The recoil jolted her shoulders, her knuckles whitening, but she did not falter. Around her, others drew courage from the sight. A dozen rifles joined hers, then a score, a chorus of light against the dark. For an instant the swarm slowed, its bodies piling against the bottleneck, their shrieks overlapping into a metallic wail. But an instant was all it was. The tyrant did not move again. Its mind sufficed. The gaunts adapted, splitting their rush into 2 flanking streams, scuttling over walls slick with ichor, claws finding purchase where no handhold should exist. One dropped from the ceiling into the midst of the line, tearing a guardsman open before the man even turned. Another sprang across a conveyor track, its bone rifle spitting at near point blank, carving 2 soldiers down before a bayonet split its throat. The defenders roared, but roars did not slow the tide. Then came the shadows between the machines. Too fast, too fluid. Gene stealers. They darted from cover to cover, their talons scissoring through armor as if it were parchment. One tore through 3 Skitarii in a blur, their galvanic rifles still firing as their bodies fell in halves. Another climbed a support pillar, its tongue flicking the air like a serpent's, then dropped into the midst of a Medicae team, vanishing into a fountain of blood. The line buckled, not from lack of will, but from too many angles, too many hungers at once. Helbrecht himself entered then, descending the stairwell with a squad of his command cadre. His armor was scoured, his face streaked with soot, but his stride was iron. He cut through gaunts with his power sword blazing, each stroke a thunderclap in the din. He reached the woman just as a Genostealer lunged for her throat, his blade catching the Xenos mid-leap, bisecting it in a flash of incandescent blue. The woman looked at him once, eyes wide with gratitude and terror, then returned to her rifle. She had no words left to spend. "Hold the line," Helbrecht said, his voice flat in the vox, and somehow the words steadied every hand. For a time it seemed they might. The tyrant watched from the edge, its carapace lit in strobes of muzzle flash, its alien gaze unreadable. Perhaps it measured us. Perhaps it amused itself with our futility. Or perhaps it was waiting for the next organism to arrive. Because arrive it did. The wall of the manufactorum ruptured inward. Not from within, not from collapse, but from something burrowing through the ferrocrete like it was parchment. Moloch. Its emergence was an eruption of dust and teeth, a cavernous mouth opening to swallow men, machines, and barricades alike. The shockwave hurled bodies against walls, snapped girders, and overturned heavy bolters as if they were toys. In the sudden chaos, the swarm surged forward again, capitalizing on the panic with surgical precision. Helbrecht rallied what remained. His command squad drove into the Moloch's flank, power swords and meltaguns burning into its hide. It shrieked, its massive coils writhing, crushing girders and tanks alike. The ground quaked as if the hive itself was breaking apart. Yet even wounded, the beast did not falter. It had come for more than kills. It had come to clear the way for the swarm. The tyrant moved at last. It advanced through the wreckage, its wings unfurling in a grotesque parody of majesty, scattering fire with contemptuous swipes of its blade. Bolter shells ricocheted harmlessly from its hide, plasma bolts burned shallow furrows, but nothing pierced deep enough. The defenders met it with everything they had. Heavy weapons braced against broken scaffolds. Skitarii pumped volley after volley into its advance. Guardsmen screamed their oaths and fired until their barrels warped. The woman with the cogcloth emptied her pack, reloaded, and emptied another. Still the tyrant came, unstoppable, inevitable.
The siege of flesh and iron was not a battle. It was the devouring of hope, bite by bite. And as the hive walls trembled, as the capillary towers pulsed higher, as the tyrant's blade carved arcs of death in the smoke, the defenders began to understand. This was not war. This was harvest. The world did not fall in an instant. Worlds rarely do. It lingered, groaning like a giant dragged into the sea, its body broken, but not yet stilled. Duran Secundus was such a giant. Its hives cracked and burned, its manufactura bled out into twisted heaps of slag, its people scattered into tunnels and wastes. Yet still it breathed, and that was enough for the Tyranids, enough for them to feed. The siege of flesh and iron had not been victory nor even defeat. It had been unveiling. The illusion that Duran Secundus could resist, that walls and guns and men might hold the tide, was stripped away. In its place stood only Humber. The swarm pressed inward, capillary towers rising through the ruins like obscene monuments. They pulsed in rhythm, thick veins of organic matter pumping into the sky, linking into the bioships that hung above like vultures that had already claimed their kill. The defenders who remained did not call it war anymore. They called it survival, though survival itself was a lie. The guard that once numbered in the tens of thousands was a fraction of its former self, its regiments broken into roving bands clinging to ruined streets. Skitarii cohorts had been cut down to lone survivors, their optics cracked, their once perfect synchrony reduced to individual bursts of fire in the dark. Civilians huddled in vaults that grew hotter and fouler with each passing hour, their prayers whispered into the silence between bombardments. The ecclesiarchy still sang, their voices ragged, hymns echoing against stone walls already trembling with the pulse of alien roots, but the sound no longer inspired. It only reminded them they were still alive and would soon wish they were not. Above, the bioships fed. Vast organisms opened their cavernous maws to the pulsing towers, siphoning oceans, atmospheres, and the biomass of the dead into their hungering gullets. Storms brewed across the sky where matter was torn upward, whole rivers reversed in their flow, rising in glittering arcs into the clouds. Fish twisted and burst in midair, their bodies dissolved before they even reached the ships. The seas themselves shrank back, leaving salt-cracked earth behind. It was not destruction, it was consumption. On the surface, the swarm no longer hurried. It did not need to. The great battles were over. What remained was collection. Gaunts prowled the ruins in endless packs, not as soldiers, but as harvesters, rooting out the last pockets of human resistance, dragging bodies back into the towers where they were broken down into formless, nutrient sludge. Larger beasts tore open vaults with contemptuous ease, their talons carving through adamantine doors as if they were parchment. Those within were not killed swiftly. The Tyranids carried them out, alive, screaming, dragged into the waiting veins of the towers. Their cries echoed through the ruins long after they were gone. The Psychers felt it worst. Those few astropaths who had survived the first days now writhed in silence, their eyes vacant, their mouths dribbling foam. They were drowning, their minds swamped by the shadow and the warp, the psychic pressure of the swarm's gestalt intelligence pressing down like an ocean. Some clawed their own skulls open, desperate to end the pressure. Others fell still, their hearts stopping as if squeezed by an invisible hand. No one attempted to send word beyond the world again. There was no point. The Astronomican's light could not pierce the shadow now. Duran Secundus was already forgotten. The survivors told stories to each other in the dark, clinging to rumors like driftwood in a storm. Some said the Astartes would come, descending like angels with bolters blazing to cleanse the world. Others whispered of exterminatus, that the Inquisition would consign the planet to fire rather than allow it to feed the swarm. Both stories brought no comfort, for angels had not come and fire had not fallen. Only the Tyranids were here, and they were endless. The harvest was total. The swarm drank the seas until the basins cracked and boiled. It stripped forests until the ground was bare and gray. It drained the very atmosphere, each breath the survivors took thinner, drier, tasting of dust and blood. And when flesh was gone, it feasted on bone. When bone was gone, it feasted on stone. Even the planet itself was food, its minerals drawn upward into the ever-thickening powers, its core groaning as if it, too, would be swallowed.
The last battles were not battles at all. They were massacres. The guard, who still bore lasguns, fired them into the dark until their packs hissed empty, then fought with bayonets until their arms gave out. Skitarii fought until their augmentic limbs sparked and failed, their optics dimming one by one. The ecclesiarchy stood before their flock, their torches held high, their voices breaking as they chanted his name. None of them stopped until their throats were torn open, their flames snuffed beneath alien feet. The woman with the cogcloth in her hair was last seen standing atop a manufactorum gantry, firing into the tide until the beam of her lasgun glowed white and split. The swarm took her like it took everything else. And yet, through it all, the harvest was not cruel. That was the worst of it. There was no malice, no rage, no sadism in the devouring, only hunger. Pure, impersonal, unrelenting hunger. The swarm did not gloat, it did not sneer, it did not savor. It consumed, and in its consumption it erased all that had been. When the last hive fell, when the last vault was opened, when the last human voice was silenced, the world was still not done. The swarm burrowed deeper, its towers sinking roots into the mantle, its bioships drinking until even the air itself trembled. Lightning split the skies in veins of green and purple, storms no longer bound by natural law but by the feeding rhythm of the Tyranid mind. The planet groaned in agony, its crust splitting, its seas gone, its skies empty. And then, silence. Duran Secundus was no more. It had not been conquered, nor destroyed. It had been consumed, utterly and completely until nothing remained but dust, ash, and memory. But the swarm did not linger.
It never lingered. Already the bioships turned, their shadows stretching across the void, their hunger unsated. The capillary towers withered behind them, collapsing into hollow husks as the swarm moved on. There was nothing left to take, nothing left to give. The world was a carcass, stripped to bone, abandoned as the swarm sought its next prey. And in the dark of the galaxy, many worlds trembled. For they knew the fate of Durin Secundus was not unique. It was a pattern, and patterns repeat. The husk of Durin Secundus did not fall silent all at once. Silence came slowly, like ash drifting after a fire, settling over streets that no longer had names. In the cracks of the hive ruins, a few figures still moved, gaunt and pale, their eyes wide with disbelief that breath still lingered in their lungs. They were not soldiers anymore. They were not even survivors. They were remnants, caught between death and memory, stumbling through a world that no longer wanted them. In the Manufactorum vaults, those who had trusted the seals awoke to find air thin and stinking of rot. The walls wept with condensation tainted by alien veins that had punched through rockcrete. Children coughed until their throats bled, mothers pressed palms against doors that would not open, and priests whispered litanies into the stale dark. When at last the Tyranids tore into the chambers, the people were too weak to scream. They were gathered up, carried into the roots of the towers, and dissolved into nutrient slurry as easily as water poured into a cup. On the surface, the remnants moved like shadows. A guardsman, his uniform in tatters, carried a lasgun with no charge. He clutched it still, not as weapon, but as relic, muttering the name of his regiment as if reciting it aloud might conjure them back from the grave. Ascatarius, half her augmentics ruined, optic lens shattered, stalked beside him. Her movements were jerky, her vox grill cracked, her speech reduced to bursts of static. Still she walked, and in walking bore witness. They did not speak to one another, they did not need to. Their footsteps said enough. We remain. For now. Above, the skies boiled. The bioships loomed vast as continents, their gullets gaping to drink rivers that poured upward in shining arcs. Lightning split the skies in veins of green and purple, storms no longer bound by natural law, but by the feeding rhythm of the Tyranid mind. The planet groaned in agony, its crust splitting, its seas gone, its skies empty. And then, silence. One such remnant, an astropath too frail to walk, lay slumped against a collapsed shrine. His sockets were hollow, torn out by his own hands days before. Still his lips moved. Those near him leaned close to hear words that slipped from his tongue like fragments of litany. He spoke of a shadow vast beyond measure, of a hunger that reached beyond the stars, of the Emperor's light dimming until it was but a single candle in endless night. Some listened and despaired. Others covered their ears, insisting the words were lies. None of them stopped until their throats were torn open, their flames snuffed beneath alien feet. Perhaps he was not speaking to them at all. Perhaps his words were for the void itself.
As the towers pulsed, the ground broke. Oceans had long since risen into the sky, leaving salt flats that cracked underfoot. The earth sagged, its mantle leached into the veins, its crust shattering like old parchment. Caverns collapsed, swallowing streets whole, dragging cathedrals into the abyss. And still, the swarm fed. There was no pause, no mercy, no recognition of the world's suffering. The Tyranids drank until there was nothing left. Those last humans who witnessed it did not see victory or loss. They saw transformation. Their world was not dying. It was being rewritten. Where cities had stood, forests of alien growth rose. Where seas had spread, capillary roots pulsed in the open air, their fluids glowing with stolen phosphorescence. The very air shifted, chemical balances rearranged to suit the needs of the swarm. What had been Durin Secundus was now something else entirely. A memory erased, replaced by biomass waiting to be carried into the fleet.
Some claimed they heard the Emperor then. In the hush between bombardments, in the thin rasp of failing lungs, in the echoes of hymns sung by dead throats. A hand on the shoulder, a voice in the ear, a warmth that could not belong to a corpse world. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps it was delusion. Perhaps it was only the warp itself, savoring the agony of a devoured world. The survivors did not know. They only clung to the feeling, because clinging was all that remained. And then, even they were gone. Dragged screaming into towers, crushed beneath rubble, starved in tunnels, struck down by claws that did not hesitate. The last human eye closed, the last human breath exhaled, and the last human prayer dissolved into silence. Yet silence was not the end, for the husk of Duran Secundus still echoed, and the galaxy listened. The death of Duran Secundus was not a moment, it was a state, a condition carved into the void. When the last human heart ceased its beat, the planet itself still groaned beneath the pressure of the swarm's appetite. Mountains slumped like melted wax, their ore veins sucked upward into the capillary spines. Oceans no longer existed, yet still the seabed steamed as if reluctant to admit their absence. Even the skies had lost their shape, transformed into a bruised haze of chemical vapors that stung the tongue and scorched the lungs. The planet was not empty, it was full. Full of Tyranid reclamation, full of stolen life, full of echoes. Those echoes haunted every ruin. Vox units, cracked and powerless, hissed with faint transmissions that should not have been possible. A guardsman's death cry repeated on a loop across 100 miles. The laughter of a child, impossible, unforgettable, bounced between hive spires that no longer stood. When explorers of the Ordo Xenos one day sifted through fragments of intercepted transmissions, they argued whether these sounds were psychic residue or the work of the hive mind mocking its prey. No consensus was reached. The only certainty was that the planet itself remembered, and memory hurt more than death. The psychic shadow lingered, a pressure that outlasted the swarm. Even after the bioships moved on, the warp above Duran Secundus was heavy with the taste of hunger. Astropaths in distant systems woke screaming, their eyes filled with visions of bone towers and bleeding skies. Navis Nubilitae pilots chartered courses that bent away from the husk world instinctively, their souls recoiling as if from an open grave. Duran Secundus no longer existed on imperial maps, yet every navigator who felt its absence knew where it lay, as if the void itself bore the scar. In the ruins there were no voices left to tell the tale, but the stones themselves seemed to murmur. Ecclesiastical cathedra, their spires gnawed into skeletal silhouettes, groaned in high winds like choirs mourning without end. Manufactura shells clanged with hollow resonance, as if the machines within still tried to sing their labor song. Capillary towers, now withered and collapsing, beat once more like dying hearts, their pulses fading into silence only after weeks of grotesque persistence. The world was dead, but it could not stop remembering that it had lived. The Inquisition would later call it a husk planet, a designation that meant little to those who had seen its bones firsthand. To them it was a graveyard without graves. No markers stood, no epitaphs remained. The swarm left nothing to bury, nothing to mourn, nothing to name. And yet, paradoxically, the absence became presence. Pilots whispered that they saw the shadows of cities from orbit, though no city remained. Surveyors swore that Auspex returns shaped themselves into human outlines before dissolving. One even claimed to hear, across an open comm, the voice of his own mother reciting a prayer she had taught him as a child. She had died decades before, on a world untouched by Tyranids.
Some said this was the Emperor's hand, reaching across the warp to remind his people of the cost of complacency. Others insisted it was the hive mind itself, a cruel reflection of humanity cast back into the void to break its will. The truth was unknowable. What mattered was that the husk world screamed, and its scream could be felt far beyond its orbit. In the decades that followed, no colonists attempted to reclaim Duran Secundus. Even the Mechanicus, so eager to strip derelict worlds for scrap, kept its forges away. They muttered of contamination, of machine spirits unwilling to set foot on haunted soil. And so the husk remained, adrift in its slow orbit around a sun that seemed colder, darker, ashamed to shine on what was left. The harvest was complete. The swarm was gone. Yet the wounded left behind bled still, not in matter, but in memory. And memory has a way of spreading farther than any fleet. When the Tyranids depart, they do not leave a corpse so much as an echo. A world consumed is stripped to silence, yet silence is not absence. It carries weight. It presses on the soul. Those who sail too near a husk world in the aftermath speak of it with hushed tones, as though the place itself listens. Duran Secundus was no exception. Once the swarm had finished its harvest and slipped back into the void, the planet remained, not alive, not dead, but something worse. Ships of the Imperium avoided its orbit instinctively. Navigators charted courses that bent away from it by instinct, even when logic dictated shorter routes. They would claim later that their visions swam with images of faces pressed against glass, with whispers that slithered along the edges of thought. Astropaths recoiled when their minds brushed the husk, their tongues stiffening against unspoken words, their skin erupting in bloodless frost. Something lingered there, not in matter, but in memory. The first sanctioned return was made by the Ordo Xenos, their frigate Maledictus descending through the broken skies with every gun at the ready. The planet below was a wasteland of collapsed towers and salt flats, its surface pocked by the hollow stumps of capillary growths. Yet when the kill teams touched down, their Auspex unit screamed with phantom readings. Shadows of cities danced across their displays, though no city stood. Vox feeds carried snatches of hymns, the same verse repeated in tones that did not belong to the living. The Inquisitor in command recorded every anomaly with clinical precision, but his retinue whispered of curses, of spirits trapped in the soil. When he was found days later pacing the command deck with a bolter in hand, raving about voices in the vents, his acolytes said nothing. They only tightened their grips on their weapons and kept their distance. The Ecclesiasticus, of course, proclaimed it a miracle. To them, husk worlds were scars left upon the galaxy by the Emperor himself, warnings etched into stone and void. Pilgrims were sometimes smuggled to the surface, led by zealots who believed that kneeling on devoured earth brought one closer to understanding his sacrifice. Many never returned. Those who did spoke of dreams heavy with images of claw and maw, of seas boiling upward, of cathedrals wailing like flutes in the wind. A few returned convinced they had heard the Emperor's voice, not as comfort, but as command, to bear witness, to never forget. Yet the Mechanicus saw no divinity in the echoes. To them, husk worlds were anomalies, errors in the system of the universe.
They sent probes into the atmosphere of Duran Secundus, drones that returned garbled data streams of fractured cogitator hymns and corrupted Benharic code. A Scitarius kill team that landed in the old Manufactorum Quarter reported hearing the machine spirits themselves weeping. Not figuratively, actual sound, metallic sobs reverberating through collapsed ducts. Their commander logged the event as ambient interference caused by xenobiological residue. But the troopers' eyes told another story when they returned to the ship, unblinking, hollow, as though they had left something of themselves behind.
It is said that husk worlds are haunted, not by ghosts in the imperial sense, for souls consumed by the Tyranids leave no trace for the warp to cradle. No, these hauntings are stranger. They are impressions, psychic bruises pressed so deep into reality that they never heal. The hive mind devours thought as much as flesh, and in its passing it leaves a distortion behind. Some call it a scream without end. Others say it is simply humanity, refusing to be erased, forcing itself into the fabric of the world by sheer will. Whatever the truth, those who step upon such soil hear it, sometimes faint, sometimes deafening, but always there. And so Duran Secundus remained, not reclaimed, not forgotten. A scar upon the void, a world that could not die quietly. Its ruins stood empty, yet full of echoes, full of shadows, full of ghosts that were not ghosts at all. The return to Duran Secundus never lasted long. Records from the Administratum tell of sanctioned survey teams whose landers touched the surface only to lift off again within hours, their crews pale, trembling, unable to explain why their auspexes shorted out or why their own voices returned to them seconds after they were spoken. Even hardened veterans of the Death Watch admitted unease. They described the sensation of being watched, not by hidden Tyranids, they had long since fled the husk, but by the world itself. The ruins had a way of lying. Walkers trudged through corridors where no corridors had ever existed. Auspexes painted streets in neat grids, though the ground below showed only broken plains. And when a man stared too long at the horizon, he might swear he saw whole cities rising, towers gleaming as if the devouring had never come. But the moment he blinked, it was gone, and only blackened stumps and ash flats remained. One report spoke of a pilot who descended too close to the ruins of Hive Albrax. His picked feed showed a hive alive with traffic, windows lit, vox towers humming. His lander's crew swore they could hear market criers, the laughter of children. By the time the ship returned to orbit, the pilot was babbling, convinced he had delivered supplies to a city still breathing. The crew found his cargo untouched, his hold still full, but he would not believe them. Whispers spread among the Imperium's faithful. Pilgrims claimed to have seen saints walking across the wastes, their robes billowing though there was no wind, their faces luminous with sorrow. Others claimed that if you knelt and pressed your ear to the soil, you could hear prayers rising from beneath, as if the devoured themselves still begged the Emperor to remember them. Others described the opposite, the sound of claws on metal, of breath rasping through alien throats, of Tyranid screeches still echoing through tunnels that no longer existed. The ecclesiarchy called these visions trials of faith, meant to test the strength of the believer's heart. Yet more than one priest who dared preach atop the husk collapsed mid-sermon, their mouths opening to pour out not scripture, but the shrill, chittering cries of the swarm.
The Mechanicus sought to classify these disturbances. They called them psychic scars, residual imprints left by the hive mind's passage. No souls remained, they argued, only corrupted resonance, the warp itself bearing the weight of memory. A Magos Dominus who studied the husk dared to suggest that the Tyranids left these scars deliberately, to dissuade reclamation, to poison the galaxy with fear even after moving on. He was silenced swiftly, his research sealed, his name struck from the rolls. Still, fragments of his logs survived, and in them he wrote of hearing binary hymns from vox arrays that had long since been devoured, of data slates that played back files no human had recorded. "The machines remember," he wrote, "and memory is contagious." Others disagreed, and Ordo Xenos Inquisitor wrote that what remained on Duran Secundus was not scar nor warning, but rebellion. That humanity's collective will to endure was so powerful, so desperate, that even after death it imprinted itself upon the warp. To him, the ghosts were proof not of Tyranid cruelty, but of imperial defiance, that a world could refuse erasure by sheer force of memory. His treatise was suppressed, for such ideas bordered too closely to heresy, but his words survived in whispers. Pilgrims repeated them like secret scripture, that the dead of Duran Secundus still spoke, because they chose to. Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. Ships that passed near the system reported vox interference, shaped like voices. Navigators charted detours rather than sail too close. The Astra Militarum drilled recruits with Husk-world litanies, warning them never to trust what they saw, never to believe what they heard. And still, rumors spread. Some claimed that a custodian guard had once walked the surface of a Husk world, searching for echoes of his will, and returned silent, his face pale beneath his helm. Others whispered of black ships that lingered above such planets longer than necessary, harvesting what psychers they could, as though the echoes themselves were dangerous to leave uncollected. But for most, the ghosts remained nothing more than rumor. Fragments carried across star systems, tales told in the mess halls of void ships, or litanies whispered in the dark. No one could prove them, yet no one could banish them either. They clung, as tenacious as the memories of those who had died. And so Duran Secundus endured, not in stone, nor in steel, nor even in flesh, but in story. Haunted, cursed, holy, or scarred, it did not matter. The world lived on, in the only way the swarm had not yet learned to devour.
The strangest echoes did not come in visions or dreams, but in transmissions. Long after the Tyranids had moved on, the void above Duran Secundus continued to bleed out vox signals. Imperial frigates passing at the edge of the system intercepted distress calls dated weeks, months, even years after the world had been consumed. The voices were clear, too clear. Platoon commanders requesting reinforcement, astropaths reciting coordinates, children sobbing into channels never meant for them. Entire regiments logged the signals as legitimate until they checked the timestamps and realized the senders had died before the messages were even spoken. The echoes were not random, they repeated in cycles, rising and fading with the rhythm of the world's rotation, as though the planet itself had become a broken vox array, endlessly replaying the final cries of its people. An Imperial Navy captain, weary of superstition, ordered a survey beacon dropped into orbit to cut through the noise. The beacon never reported back. Instead, a single message looped from its frequency. "We are still here. Do not abandon us." The voice was his own. His ship withdrew, its crew mutinous at the thought of staying. He never spoke of it again. The ecclesiarchy took such reports as divine signs. They called the echoes the martyr's choir, proof that the emperor's faithful could not be silenced even in death. Pilgrimages grew, reckless and unsanctioned, with rogue traders ferrying penitents to the husk world so they might kneel in its dust and hear the ghosts themselves. Many never returned.
Those who did came back with hollow eyes and cracked voices, claiming to have heard sermons whispered from beneath the ground, voices naming them, promising salvation if they only remained. Some believed the promises, some cut their own throats rather than carry them further. The Mechanicus, ever suspicious of mystery, scoured the ruins with drones and servo skulls. They documented inexplicable power surges in structures stripped of all wiring, binary strings repeating themselves in the rust of collapsed manufactura, and cogitators that lit for an instant when none remained intact. Data phantoms, they called them, errors imprinted into the circuitry of a world devoured. But their reports admitted something they did not say aloud. The phantoms responded when queried in binaric. They answered, their replies not random static but coherent, fragmented, almost pleading. "We are not finished," one machine croaked. "Do not leave us in the dark." For the Ordo Enos, the husk world became an object of dread study. Inquisitorial kill teams reported hallucinations so convincing they fired on comrades, believing them to be Tyranid forms lurking in the smoke. One squad swore they found a chapel intact, candles burning, hymns echoing. They entered, dropping to their knees. Only later, when reinforcements found them, did it become clear they had been kneeling in the open air, surrounded by nothing but ash. They died within the week, each raving of eyes that would not close when they slept. The Inquisition classified the world as interdicted, its coordinates restricted to clearance levels higher than most generals ever achieved.
But stories bled beyond classification. Captains in the void whispered of ghost lights drifting through orbit, forming the outline of a hive spire that had long since been torn down. Vox officers admitted they sometimes heard their own voices whispering back to them. A second later, a tone lower, as though another self spoke from within the husk. Navigators refused to chart courses through the system, their warp sight clouded by visions of teeth and oceans rising into the sky. To pass too close was to invite madness. And yet, despite every warning, there were always those who returned. Scholars hunting proof of psychic residue, priests yearning for a taste of martyrdom, desperate refugees searching for family they knew could not still live. They came in landers and shuttles, their hulls scorched by the lingering storms. Few stayed long, fewer returned at all. But all who set foot upon the husk spoke of the same thing, the sensation that the world itself resisted erasure, as though beneath the dust, beneath the scar, beneath the silence, Duran Secundus still fought, not with weapons or walls, but with memory. The Tyranids had consumed its matter, they had devoured its seas, its stone, its very air. Yet something remained, something they could not swallow. And in the quiet between the echoes, that something whispered, not loud, not clear, but enough. The Imperium does not forget easily, but it forgets selectively. Whole regiments may vanish from record, entire sectors may be redacted into black ink, yet the scars of husk worlds are never erased. They linger, not just in archives, but in the marrow of those who hear the stories. Duran Secundus was one such scar, a reminder etched not by parchment or proclamation, but by the weight of silence itself. Officially, the administratum marked it as exterminatus class ruin, a convenient fiction. No firestorm had scoured the planet, no cyclonic torpedoes had cracked its crust, but such language made it easier to bear, easier to file, easier to consign the loss to a line in a ledger. For the common citizen of the Imperium, however, the truth seeped through. Rumors spread in vox markets and shrine halls alike, a world where the dead still cried for help, where the soil whispered, where the shadows of children ran between ruins no longer standing. Fear, once seeded, grew faster than any crop. Husk worlds became more than cautionary tales.
They became curses. Superstitious voidfarers refused to sail within a dozen light-years of one, fearing that to glimpse its broken horizon was to invite the swarm itself. Pilgrims carried soil taken from such places in reliquaries, believing it would grant visions of martyrdom or nightmares vivid enough to feel like prophecy. Some commanders, ruthless enough to use fear as a weapon, threatened wayward soldiers with redeployment to Huskworld garrisons, though few ever followed through. The men would rather be executed. And yet, in the high towers of Terra, the phenomenon of these ghostly echoes was not dismissed so easily. The Inquisition debated in chambers sealed against the warp, arguing whether Huskworlds represented lingering psychic trauma or a new weapon of the Great Devourer. Some claimed the echoes were deliberate, that the hive mind left behind psychic traps to lure rescue fleets into ambushes. Others whispered that the echoes were not Tyranid at all, but fragments of humanity itself refusing oblivion, imprinted upon the warp through collective agony. Neither theory was proven. Both were feared.
Among the ecclesiarchy, Huskworlds took on a different meaning. Sermons thundered with their names, martyrs exalted, not for victories won, but for deaths suffered. Duran Secundus was invoked beside Armageddon and Macrage, not as battlefield, but as reliquary. "See how the Emperor preserves even in loss," preachers cried, their voices carrying across cathedral naves filled with incense smoke. The swarm devours flesh, but faith endures. The dead still sing. The Emperor does not forget. To the faithful, the haunting was proof of his eternal vigilance. To the doubtful, it was proof that even death could not free them from the weight of servitude. And then there were the whispers. Always whispers. Rogue traders swore that in the dark of Huskworld vaults one could bargain with voices not quite human, that the dead of such worlds spoke in riddles, offering secrets of the hive mind itself in exchange for remembrance. Some claimed to have heard coordinates muttered in their dreams, numbers that led to caches of technology or relics lost to the swarm. A few believed the Emperor's own hand guided them through these echoes, though just as many believed the warp itself toyed with their longing. No proof was ever found, but proof mattered little. Belief was enough. Durant Secundus endured in this way, not in strength, not in walls or armies, but in fear, in awe, in the stories told around guttering shrine candles, in the half-heard signals across Vox channels, in the hesitation of commanders who redirected their fleets rather than pass too close. It remained alive in its own fashion because humanity could not allow it to die. To forget would be to surrender to the inevitability of the swarm. To remember was to resist, even if that resistance took the form of haunted dreams and whispered prayers. And so, across the Imperium, Huskworlds became warnings, not just of Tyranid hunger, but of what remained after. They were scars in the warp, shadows that stretched farther than the claws of any beast. They taught a single lesson, carved into void and soul alike. The great devourer does not merely kill. It leaves behind emptiness that remembers. And sometimes, emptiness is the most terrifying enemy of all. There are some who insist that nothing survives the Tyranids, that once the swarm descends, no spirit, no memory, no trace remains. And yet this is not the whole truth, because if the devourer left nothing behind, then Huskworlds would not sing, they would not weep, they would not haunt. And so a question rises, one that no edict can silence, one whispered in shrine halls and barracks alike. What is it that even the Tyranids cannot devour? On Duran Secundus, that question became more than superstition. Pilgrims who dared the ash wastes returned with testimonies too consistent to dismiss. They spoke of voices calling from beneath the soil, not in words of despair, but in hymns of defiance. They claimed to see the imperial Aquila etched in the sky in lightless fire, or to feel unseen hands guiding them through mazes of ruin.
Some said the emperor himself walked there in shadow, not as radiant savior, but as mourning witness, a reminder that his gaze falls even upon the forgotten. The ecclesiarchy exalted these visions as miracles, proof that faith itself was impervious to the swarm's maw.
But others interpreted differently. An inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus wrote that such visions were not blessings, but the result of humanity's stubborn psychic resonance, a refusal to dissolve even when flesh and blood had perished. He named it the echo of defiance, a residue stronger than any fortress, born from billions who died believing that their emperor would remember them. To him, the husk was not holy, it was dangerous. For what else might endure in such scars? If faith could linger, then so could despair. If prayer imprinted upon the void, so too could curses. Among the Mechanicus, speculation whispered louder still. Some magi dared to suggest that memory itself was a form of energy, one that no Tyranid digestion could metabolize. A theory arose, unrecorded in official archives but muttered in data vaults, that the swarm, in consuming thought and flesh, inadvertently created something beyond itself, a residue it could neither control nor erase. "It is the shadow of consumption," one log read. "A remainder. The proof of subtraction is never zero." The log was quickly deleted. The magos who wrote it reassigned to distant forges, but the words persisted, copied by adepts who feared them, yet could not let them die. For the common soldier of the Astra Militarum, such mysteries mattered little. They told simpler stories, that the Tyranids could devour steel and bone, but not the courage of a man who died fighting. That a guardsman's last scream carved itself into the warp more deeply than any claws. That so long as one person remembered, the devourer could never truly win. These stories, crude as they were, spread faster than litanies. They offered soldiers something beyond certainty of death. The belief that their end would matter, that their pain would endure, and in enduring, would resist. There are darker rumors, too. Tales of psychers who listened too closely to husk worlds, who opened themselves to the echoes and returned changed. Some spoke in tongues not their own, reciting xenochants in human voices. Others predicted imperial defeats with terrifying accuracy, claiming the dead themselves whispered strategies into their ears. One collapsed mid-battle, shrieking that the swarm had already eaten Terra, that all the Imperium walked only in memory. His skull was split by a commissar's bolt before the panic could spread. But the rumors could not be killed, for they spoke to something deeper than fear. They spoke to the idea that within the vast, indifferent void of the galaxy, something of humanity lingered, something incorruptible, something that no teeth could shred, no acids could dissolve. Whether it was faith, memory, or the stubborn will of a species too numerous to erase, none could say. But it persisted, and in persistence it became weapon. Thus the husk of Duran Secundus, like so many before and after, was more than scar. It was a riddle, a paradox that neither priest, inquisitor, nor magos could solve. The Tyranids had devoured everything, and yet not everything was gone. And in that tension lay the seed of hope, or perhaps of doom. The paradox of the husk world was not one the Imperium could agree upon. To the ecclesiarchy, it was clear beyond question. What lingered was proof of the emperor's light, impervious even to the swarm's maw. Sermons thundered with proclamations that the devourer could strip away oceans and burn away skies, but it could not quench the faith of his people. Pilgrims on shrine worlds carried relics of dust from Duran Secundus, pressing them into wounds and swearing they felt warmth flow into their veins. Priests recounted visions of golden fire bursting across ruined landscapes, of the emperor himself walking among shadows and whispering, "You are remembered." Whether true or fever dream, these stories spread like wildfire, bringing solace to those who had no reason left to hope.
The Inquisition was less forgiving. For them, such phenomena were dangerous precisely because they offered hope. An Ordo Xenos conclave debated for months whether the echoes were a weapon seeded by the hive mind, psychic traps designed to manipulate the weak. One report spoke of an inquisitorial frigate receiving a vox call in the voice of its captain, despite that same captain standing alive upon the bridge. The voice spoke of coordinates, a system far from any star. The frigate burned its way to the point, only to find a waiting swarm. Not one survivor returned. Was this chance, or proof that the echoes could guide ships to their doom? The conclave ended without answer, but the decree was firm. To listen too closely was heresy, for heresy opened doors that should remain shut. The Mechanicus took a different path. They viewed the phenomenon as raw data. They dissected the echoes with cogitators, feeding scraps of corrupted hymn and garbled the stress call into their engines until patterns began to emerge. What they found disturbed them more than faith or suspicion ever could. The signals were not static. They evolved. Phrases altered by increments across weeks. Prayers repeated with a word missing, then another, until whole litanies unraveled into something unrecognizable. It was as though the voices themselves were learning, reshaping, growing. One Magos warned that the phenomenon represented not memory, but replication, that the echoes might one day cease to be imprints of humanity and become something else. His words were logged and sealed, his forges reassigned. Yet the fear spread, whispered in the binary chatter of adepts who could not purge it from their circuits. For the Astra Militarum, the question was more visceral. They did not argue whether the echoes were holy, cursed, or alien. They lived with them. Regiment after regiment drilled in proximity to husk worlds, and soldiers swore they heard comrades calling from the dust. A Vox operator on campaign confessed to answering those calls, speaking back to a voice he knew belonged to a friend long dead. He said the voice comforted him. He said it told him where to aim, when to duck, how to survive. His squad survived skirmishes that annihilated others. Then, one night, the operator turned his last gun on his unit, eyes blank, mouth mumbling a chant in no tongue recognized. He was executed on the spot, but his squad swore the chant remained in their ears long after the gunfire faded. Among the faithful and fearful alike, rumors grew that what endured might not be entirely human, that the echoes were no longer the voices of the devoured, but something shaped in their image, an aftertaste of the hive mind itself slipping through the cracks in the warp. Pilgrims called it blasphemy. Some inquisitors called it certainty. The Mechanicus avoided the question altogether, preferring silence to truth. And still the husk worlds persisted, their whispers refusing to die, their scars refusing to heal. Duran Secundus, like so many others, became a mirror in which the Imperium saw what it most desired or most feared. To some, proof of the Emperor's eternal protection. To others, the first taste of a new weapon seeded by the swarm. To the vast majority, it was simply a reminder, terrifying and undeniable, that there were things beyond even the galaxy's cruelest predators. And so the question deepened rather than closed. If the Tyranids could devour matter but not erase memory, what was memory? If they could strip flesh but not silence echoes, what were echoes? And if what remained could learn, could adapt, then what was it becoming? The most troubling accounts came not from priests or scholars, but from those who claimed to have felt the husk worlds speaking through them. Psychers bound for the black ship sometimes whispered of dreams soaked in ash, where unseen voices told them to stand firm, to resist, to remember. At first, their handlers dismissed these as mere nightmares born of fractured minds.
But then came the patterns. Different psychers from different sectors, all describing the same ruined cathedra, the same shattered manufactora, the same endless chant, "We remain." The Ordo Hereticus declared it dangerous convergence, evidence of warp taint, and the psychers were silenced. Yet the echoes of their testimony lingered in the vaults, filed away in ink that no fire could erase.
Among the laity, stories spread of miracles wrought by those touched by husk worlds. A guardsman was said to have survived 3 direct strikes from a carnifex's claws, his body refusing to fall until the beast lay slain. When asked how, he wept and muttered that he had heard his mother's voice from the dust of Duran Secundus, telling him to stand. A pilgrim returned from a husk with empty eyes, her vision gone, but she recited passages of scripture she had never been taught, claiming the dead themselves had sung them into her ears. A Vox officer, half-mad from weeks listening to phantom transmissions, claimed to know the swarm's movements days before they struck. His predictions saved an entire regiment before he was executed for consorting with xenotaint. Were these miracles? Were they corruption? Or were they both at once? None dared say aloud. In some circles, a darker possibility was whispered, that what could not be devoured might not belong to mankind at all, that perhaps the hive mind itself was learning through its failures, leaving behind fragments of resonance not by accident, but by design. If true, then every echo, every haunting, every voice from the dust was not defiance, it was infiltration. The notion was so heretical that even inquisitors refused to write it down. But it bled through nonetheless, carried in half-heard conversations, muttered at the edges of mess halls, whispered between shrine candles. Because if the swarm had found a way to wear human memory as mask, then hope itself could become a weapon against the Imperium. Yet others clung to the opposite interpretation with unshakable fervor. To them, husk worlds were not warnings of Tyranid trickery, but proof of humanity's incorruptible soul. They argued that no matter how complete the devouring, no matter how thorough the hunger, the Emperor's light lingered, not in grand monuments or mighty fleets, but in the smallest fragments. A child's laughter echoing in static, a hymn half sung by a dying soldier, a mother's prayer carved invisibly into the dust. These fragments were incorruptible because they were faith itself, and faith, unlike flesh, could not be consumed. This belief gave strength to entire regiments, convinced that even if they perished, their voices would remain in the void, a chorus of defiance that no swarm could silence. The tension between fear and hope could not be resolved. The Inquisition burned reports, the Mechanicus sealed data, the Ecclesiarchy exalted sermons, and still the echoes endured. They endured because they were real, or because they were believed to be real, which, in the Imperium, is often the same thing. And every time a new husk world was born, stripped to bone by the swarm, the question was asked anew: what lingers here? Is it the Emperor's blessing, or the enemy's snare? On Duran Secundus, the question pressed hardest. Decades after its fall, transmissions still leaked into the void. Sometimes they were fragments of screams, sometimes they were prayers, and once, just once, a fleet patrolling the sector intercepted a single phrase repeated over and over, in a voice no machine could identify: "We are not finished." Whether this was promise or threat, no one could say, perhaps both. But for those who heard it, the words burrowed deep, settling into memory like seeds into soil. And seeds, left long enough, always grow. There is a moment after the swarm has gone and the silence has settled, when a husk world seems at peace. No claws tear the soil, no spines pierce the sky, no shrieks shake the air. But peace is a lie. For the truest weapon of the Tyranids is not only their hunger, it is the shadow that follows. Duran Secundus remained as proof. Its surface lay still, its seas erased, its cities collapsed, yet still it spoke, not in words alone, but in the weight of its memory, pressing outward into the void.
Captains who sailed near swore that their dreams became crowded, as though they shared their sleep with millions. They woke sweating, lungs burning with the phantom taste of ash. Vox officers muted their channels, fearful of hearing familiar voices repeating prayers that no longer had mouths to speak them. Even inquisitors, trained to stare into the abyss without flinching, admitted in sealed confessionals that the husks unsettled them in ways no battlefield ever had. The swarm could be fought, however hopelessly, but how does one fight a memory that refuses to fade? The ecclesiastery found in that question a sermon that could not be silenced. The devourer cannot triumph, priests cried in temples across the stars. For even in death the faithful endure. Their voices rise, their prayers burn, their defiance remains. In their hands, husk worlds became reliquaries, not curses. Pilgrims lit candles in the dust, swearing they heard hymns stir in the wind. Some even chose to die there, believing their last breaths would join the eternal chorus. The Imperium has always been sustained as much by faith as by force, and in husk worlds, the faithful found proof that faith itself was the one meal the swarm could not swallow. But the whispers never resolved into certainty. For just as some found hope, others found dread. If faith endured, then so too could fear. If prayers imprinted themselves on the void, then what of curses, screams, and betrayal? More than one psyker reported voices not of comfort, but of command, driving them to madness, promising that the Emperor was gone, that the swarm had already won, that everything they fought for was nothing but echo. Such words were silenced with bolt rounds, yet silence did not banish them. The echoes returned in others, in different throats, as though the world itself kept reciting its wound. The Mechanicus continued to chase patterns in the static, their cogitators weaving fragments into strange shapes. Some claimed to glimpse mathematics so precise they could not be chance, as if the voices of the dead had arranged themselves into equations the living could not understand. Others whispered of signals so sharp they cut across systems, aligning with no warp route known. These findings were sealed, for fear that even knowledge itself might be devoured if pursued too far. Yet among adepts one heretical idea lingered. Perhaps what the Tyranids left behind was not error, nor miracle, but potential. Perhaps what they could not consume was becoming something new. Still, for the vast majority of the Imperium, such thoughts mattered less than the simple truth that husk worlds were never truly silent. And that truth bred both courage and terror. Recruits of the Astra Militarum swore oaths beside shrine altars built from ash soil, believing they carried the strength of the fallen within them. At the same time, veterans who had once heard the echoes begged for reassignment, unwilling to live with voices that would not leave their ears. Even voidfarers, hardened by warp storms and demonic whispers, learned to steer wide of systems marked as husks, not because they feared Tyranids still lurking, but because they feared what remained after. And so Duran Secundus, like 1,000 worlds before it and countless after, became more than ruin. It became memory, weaponized. To some, it was holy. To others, cursed. To most, it was proof that the galaxy itself remembers, whether it wishes to or not. The swarm could consume everything tangible, but not everything that mattered. What cannot be devoured is not flesh. It is not steel. It is not even stone. What cannot be devoured is the weight of memory, the persistence of faith, the residue of fear, the refusal of voices to fall silent. The devourer consumes, but it does not forget. And in that contradiction lies the Imperium's faintest glimmer of hope, and perhaps its deepest doom. For if memory itself cannot be devoured, then memory will endure long after the stars themselves fade. Whether as prayer, or curse, or something stranger still, only time will tell. But the husk worlds sing on, and the galaxy listens, even when it wishes it could not.